Being a freshman at college, I was still getting used to the whole university experience. My first semester was in full swing, and I was juggling classes, new friendships, and the occasional homesickness. One night, I found myself in a situation that I'll never forget. I had this huge paper due for my American literature class. It was worth a big chunk of my grade, and I'd been putting it off for way too long. With the deadline looming, I decided to camp out in the library to finish it. I'd been there plenty of times before, but never this late. As the hours ticked by, I watched the library slowly empty out. The quiet hum of students chatting and typing faded away, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the occasional creak of the old building. I was exhausted but determined to finish my paper. I finally wrapped up around 2 a.m. My eyes were burning from staring at the computer screen for so long, and my back ached from hunching over the desk. I packed up my stuff, feeling a mix of relief and pride at having finished the paper. As I stepped out of the library, the cool night air hit me. The campus looked different at night. Shadows everywhere, the usually bustling quad completely deserted. The streetlights cast an orange glow, creating pockets of light surrounded by darkness. I started walking towards my dorm, my footsteps echoing on the empty paths. That's when I first noticed him, just a shape at first, standing under a tree near the library. I didn't think much of it, probably another student heading home after a late-night study session. But as I walked, I realized the shape was moving, following me. I picked up my pace, telling myself I was being paranoid. But with each turn I made, the footsteps behind me kept pace. My heart started racing, and I clutched my bag tighter. I tried to think rationally. Maybe it was just someone going the same way, but deep down I knew something was wrong. I glanced back and saw him clearly for the first time. A man, probably in his 30s, wearing dark clothes. He was walking purposefully, his eyes fixed on me. That's when the fear really set in. This wasn't just my imagination, I was being followed. I started walking faster, almost jogging. The sound of his footsteps sped up too. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. Should I scream? Try to find help? But the campus was deserted and my dorm was still a few minutes away. I cut across the lawn, hoping to lose him, but he matched my path. The grass muffled our footsteps, making it hard to tell how close he was. I could hear my own ragged breathing as panic set in. This was really happening. As I reached the edge of the quad, I heard him break into a run. That's when I lost it. I sprinted as fast as I could, my backpack bouncing painfully against my spine. I could hear him behind me getting closer. The world narrowed to just me, him, and the distance to my dorm. I've never run so fast in my life. My lungs were burning, and I could taste metal in my mouth. But all I could think about was getting to safety. I saw my dorm building ahead and pushed myself harder. I fumbled with my key card at the door, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold it. I could hear his footsteps getting closer. Closer. After what felt like an eternity, the door beeped and unlocked. I yanked it open and threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, gasping for air, listening. I could hear him outside, pacing, trying the door. I was terrified he'd somehow get in. But after a few minutes, I heard footsteps moving away. I stayed there, frozen, for what felt like hours. Every sound made me jump. I kept expecting to hear him coming back, trying to break in. But the night remained quiet. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in my room, lights on, staring at the door. Every creak of the building, every distant voice outside sent a jolt of fear through me. I debated calling campus security, but what would I tell them? That someone followed me? It sounded so minor when I thought about saying it out loud. The next morning, still shaken, I went to my first class. That's when I overheard some girls talking. They were saying how a man had been arrested on campus early that morning. Apparently, he was a convicted stalker who'd been targeting college students in the area. As they described him, I felt the blood drain from my face. It was him, the man who'd chased me. He'd been caught trying to break into another dorm building just a couple hours after he'd followed me. I learned later that he wasn't even a student. He'd been sneaking onto campus, blending in with the crowds, looking for victims. And last night, I'd been alone in exactly the wrong place at the wrong time. I still think about what could have happened if I hadn't made it to my dorm in time. The whole experience shook me to my core, and it took a long time before I felt safe on campus again, especially at night. Hey there. Hope you're enjoying the video so far. If you do, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps the channel to grow and reach more people. And now. My sophomore year at college was supposed to be easier than the first. I'd figured out the whole dorm life thing, had a good group of friends, and was settling into my classes. But something happened that year that shook me to my core and changed how I saw the world. I was living in one of the older dorms on campus. It was this big, brick building that had been around since the 1950s. It had character, sure, but it also had its quirks. The heating was unpredictable, the elevators were temperamental, and the windows sometimes stuck. But it was home. My roommate Michelle and I got along well enough. We weren't best friends or anything, but we respected each other's space and schedules. She was a night owl, often staying up late to study or work on projects. I was more of an early bird, usually in bed by 11 and up at the crack of dawn. The night it happened was pretty typical. I'd gone to bed around my usual time while Michelle was still at her desk, hunched over some assignment. I remember thinking how glad I was that her desk lamp didn't bother me anymore. I'd gotten used to sleeping with that bit of light in the room. I'm not sure how long I'd been asleep when it happened. You know how sometimes you wake up and you're not sure why? It was like that, but with this underlying feeling that something wasn't right. The room felt different somehow. Tense, like the air itself was holding its breath. Then I heard it. A sound that didn't belong. It wasn't Michelle typing or turning pages. It was softer, rhythmic, breathing, but not from where Michelle's bed was. I opened my eyes, just a crack at first. The room was dimmer than usual. Michelle's desk lamp was off, but there was enough light from the street lamps outside to see shapes. And there was a shape that shouldn't have been there. A dark silhouette, standing perfectly still between our beds. For a moment I thought I was dreaming. I blinked hard, expecting the shape to disappear, but it didn't. It was still there, solid and real. And then I realized it was facing Michelle's bed, watching her. I couldn't move. It was like my body had forgotten how. I just lay there, eyes wide open now, staring at this stranger in our room. My mind was blank, unable to process what was happening. And then Michelle screamed. It was like a spell breaking. Suddenly everything was motion and noise. Michelle bolted upright in her bed, still screaming. The figure jerked, startled. I fumbled for my bedside lamp, my hands clumsy with fear and sleep. The light clicked on, flooding the room with sudden brightness. And there he was, a man, probably in his late 20s, dressed all in black. He looked as shocked as we were, his eyes wide and darting between Michelle and me. For a split second, we all just stared at each other. Then he moved, fast. He lunged for the door, yanking it open. Michelle was still screaming. I tried to shout, to call for help, but my voice came out as a croak. He was out the door in seconds. I heard his footsteps pounding down the hallway. By now, other doors were opening. Confused voices called out, asking what was happening. Michelle and I just sat there staring at the open door. She'd stopped screaming, but was making these little gasping sounds. I realized I was shaking, my whole body trembling like I was freezing cold. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes before our RA showed up. She took one look at us and called campus security. Soon our room was full of people, security officers, the dorm supervisor, concerned students peering in from the hallway. We had to tell the story over and over, to security, to the police when they arrived, to the dean of students the next day. Each time it felt less real. How could this have happened? How did he get in? The next few days were a blur. Michelle and I both called our parents. The university offered to move us to a new room, but we decided to stay. Somehow the idea of packing up and leaving felt like letting him win. They stepped up security in all the dorms, new locks, more night patrols. For a while, every little noise at night would jerk me awake. I'd lie there, heart pounding, sure that I'd open my eyes to see him standing there again. It was about a week later that we found out who he was. The police had caught him trying to break into another dorm across campus. Turned out he was a former student who'd dropped out a couple years back. He'd been sneaking into dorms for months, watching girls sleep. They found pictures on his phone, dozens of them, girls sleeping unaware they were being watched. Michelle and I were lucky. We woke up. Who knows what might have happened if we hadn't? The whole thing messed me up for a long time. I had trouble sleeping, trouble concentrating in class, but slowly, things got better. Michelle and I became closer. Nothing bonds you like shared trauma, I guess. In the end, they charged the guy with multiple counts of breaking and entering, voyeurism, and stalking. He went to jail. But sometimes I still wake up in the night sure that I can hear someone breathing in the dark. The frat party was in full swing when I got there. Music blasted from speakers, bodies packed every room, and the air was thick with the smell of beer and sweat. My friends and I had been looking forward to this all week. It was supposed to be the biggest party of the semester, and everyone who was anyone would be there. We pushed our way through the crowd, laughing and shouting over the music. The energy was electric. People were dancing, drinking, and having the time of their lives. For a while, we stuck together, dancing and chatting with people we knew from classes or other parties. As the night wore on, I lost track of my friends in the sea of people. I wasn't too worried at first. It happened all the time at parties like this. I figured I'd run into them again soon enough. I decided to get another drink while I looked for them. The makeshift bar in the kitchen was crowded, so I had to wait my turn. That's when this guy approached me. He was tall, good-looking, and had a friendly smile. He asked if I wanted a drink, and I said sure. Why not? It was a party, after all. He disappeared into the crowd and came back a few minutes later with a red plastic cup. I thanked him and took a sip. It was some kind of mixed drink, sweet but with a strong kick of alcohol. We tried to chat over the music, but I don't remember what we talked about. Just small talk, probably. It wasn't long after that when I started to feel off. At first, I thought maybe I was just tired, or the alcohol was hitting me harder than usual. But this felt different. The room seemed to tilt and sway, and the lights left trails when I moved my head. Sounds became muffled, like I was underwater. I tried to focus, to shake it off, but it only got worse. My limbs felt heavy, and I was having trouble forming coherent thoughts. I remember thinking that I needed to find my friends, that I needed to leave, but I couldn't seem to make my body cooperate. That's when the guy from earlier reappeared. He was saying something, but I couldn't make out the words. His face seemed to blur and shift. I felt his hand on my arm, and he was leading me somewhere. A part of me knew this was wrong, that I should resist, but I couldn't seem to make my body listen. We were moving through the crowd, and I stumbled more than once. He kept me upright, kept moving. I remember catching glimpses of faces as we passed, but they all blurred together. No one seemed to notice anything was wrong. We were heading towards the stairs. Even in my confused state, I knew what that meant. Bedrooms were upstairs. I tried to pull away to say no, but my voice came out as a mumble. My legs felt like they were made of lead. And then, suddenly, there was another hand on my arm. A familiar voice cut through the fog. It was my friend, Lisa. She was there, and she was angry. I couldn't focus on what she was saying, but her tone was sharp, confrontational. The guy let go of me, and I nearly fell. Lisa caught me, held me up. I remember her face swimming into focus for a moment, her eyes wide with concern and fury. Then we were moving again, but this time towards the exit. The cool night air hit me like a slap when we got outside. I gulped it in, feeling like I hadn't been able to breathe properly for hours. Lisa was still talking, her voice urgent, but I couldn't respond. My tongue felt too big for my mouth. We made it back to our dorm somehow. I have flashes of memory, stumbling across campus, Lisa half carrying me, the harsh fluorescent lights of our hallway. I remember being scared, Not of anything specific, but just a general, overwhelming fear that something terrible had almost happened. The next morning was hell. I woke up feeling like my head was splitting open, my mouth dry as sandpaper, but worse than the physical symptoms was the creeping horror as memories of the night before started to come back. Lisa filled in the blanks for me. She had seen the guy leading me away, had noticed how out of it I looked. She said my eyes were unfocused, and I could barely stand. She knew something was wrong and intervened. We reported it to campus security, but without knowing exactly who the guy was or having any real proof, there wasn't much they could do. They took a statement, promised to look into it, but I could tell they didn't expect much to come of it. It was a few days later that we started hearing the rumors. Other girls had similar experiences at parties thrown by the same frat. Some hadn't been as lucky as me. The stories varied, but the pattern was the same. Drugged drinks, predatory behavior, taking advantage. The university eventually launched an investigation. The frat was suspended pending the results, but for me the damage was already done. I couldn't shake the feeling of violation, of vulnerability. I kept replaying that night in my head, thinking about what could have happened if Lisa hadn't been there. I stopped going to parties for a long time after that. I was jumpy, suspicious. It took me a while to feel safe on campus again. Every time I saw someone who looked like that guy, my stomach would clench, and I'd feel that same panic rising in my throat. The worst part was the uncertainty. I never found out exactly what had been put in my drink. I never knew for sure who the guy was or if he faced any consequences. Sometimes I'd see someone on campus who looked like him and I'd freeze, wondering if it was him, if he recognized me. It changed the way I looked at everything. Parties that used to seem fun now felt dangerous. People I might have trusted before became potential threats. I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way some guys would watch girls at parties. The way they'd encourage each other to keep buying drinks for girls who were already drunk. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings. I'd check and double-check that my drink hadn't been left unattended even for a second. I'd make sure I always knew where the exits were in any room I entered. I started carrying pepper spray in my purse, just in case. The investigation dragged on for weeks. There were rumors flying around campus about what had happened, who was involved. Some people were supportive, but others, well, let's just say I learned who my real friends were. There were whispers about other incidents, stretching back years. Girls who had left the school suddenly, parties that had gotten out of hand. It was like once you knew what to look for, you could see the pattern everywhere. The frat tried to defend themselves, of course. They claimed it was just a few bad apples, that they shouldn't all be punished for the actions of a few. But the more that came out, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a one-time thing. In the end, the frat was kicked off campus. Their charter was revoked and they were banned from reforming for at least 5 years. It felt like a victory, but a hollow one. It didn't undo what had happened, didn't erase the fear and anxiety that still lingered. I stayed at the university, finished my degree. But things were different. I threw myself into my studies, spent more time in the library than at parties. I made new friends, ones who understood why I was always a little on edge, why I insisted on watching my drink being poured at bars. It's been a few years now, and I'd like to say I'm completely over it. But the truth is, I don't think I ever will be. Not entirely. It's always there, in the back of my mind. A reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, of how vulnerable we all are. I still go out sometimes, still have fun with my friends, but I'm always aware, always watching. And every time I hear about another incident like mine, it brings it all back. The fear, the helplessness, the anger. Finals week was kicking my butt. I'd been cramming for days, living off energy drinks and vending machine snacks. That night I was at the library until they kicked us out. The campus was quiet as I walked back to my dorm. It was late, and the air had that weird stillness you only get in the middle of the night. I was thinking about my economics exam, going over formulas in my head, when I heard it. A loud pop. At first I thought it was a car backfiring or maybe some idiot setting off firecrackers. But then I heard another. And another. That's when I realized they were gunshots. For a second, I just stood there trying to process what was happening. Then I heard screaming. It was coming from the direction of the student center. My brain finally caught up and I started looking around frantically for somewhere to hide. There weren't many options. The campus was pretty open, with lots of green spaces between buildings. I spotted a cluster of bushes near the psychology building and just ran for it. I dove in, not caring about the branches scratching my face and arms. I tried to make myself as small as possible, curling up into a ball. The leaves were wet from the evening dew, and I could feel the moisture seeping into my clothes. But I didn't care. All I could think about was staying hidden. More shots rang out. They sounded closer now. I could hear people running, their footsteps pounding on the pavement. Someone ran past my hiding spot so close I could have reached out and touched them. I held my breath, terrified they'd notice the bushes moving. I wanted to look, to see what was happening, but I was too scared to move. What if the shooter saw me? So I just stayed there, my face pressed into the dirt, listening. Sirens started wailing in the distance. At first it was just one, then more joined in. The campus was usually pretty quiet at night, but now it was chaos. I could hear car doors slamming, people shouting, more gunshots. I fumbled for my phone, trying to keep it hidden in the bushes. The screen was too bright, and I was afraid it would give me away. I turned the brightness all the way down and saw I had a bunch of missed calls and texts. The university had sent out an emergency alert. Active shooter on campus. Shelter in place. I wanted to call my parents, my friends, anyone, but I was too scared to make a sound. What if the shooter was nearby? I settled for sending out a few quick texts, letting people know I was okay and hidden. Time seemed to stretch out forever. I had no idea how long I'd been in those bushes. My legs were cramping up and I was shivering from the cold and fear. But I didn't dare move. At some point I heard a helicopter. Its spotlight swept over the campus and I pressed myself even harder into the ground, praying the leaves were enough to keep me hidden. The light passed over my hiding spot, and for a terrifying moment, I thought it had stopped on me. But it moved on. More shots. They sounded like they were coming from all over campus now. How many shooters were there? Was it some kind of coordinated attack? My mind was racing, imagining the worst scenarios. I could hear voices now, lots of them. They sounded official, like they were giving orders. Police, probably, but I was still too scared to look. What if it was the shooters, trying to trick people into coming out? Something hit the ground near my bush with a metallic clank. I nearly jumped out of my skin. It took me a few seconds to realize it was just an empty soda can, probably dropped by someone running past. The night got colder, and I couldn't stop shaking. Part of it was the temperature, but mostly it was fear. Every sound made me flinch. A twig snapping, leaves rustling, distant shouts. I kept imagining someone finding me, a gun pointed at my head. My phone buzzed again. Another alert from the university, shooter still at large. Remain in shelter. I wanted to scream. I was hiding in a bush, not exactly the safest shelter. But where else could I go? The shooter could be anywhere. I don't know how long I stayed there. It felt like hours. My whole body ached from being in the same position for so long. I was so tired, but there was no way I could sleep. Not with the constant sounds of sirens and shouting. At some point I realized I really needed to pee. It was such a stupid, normal thing to worry about in the middle of all this. But my bladder was screaming at me. I tried to hold it, but eventually I had no choice. I shifted slightly, trying to relieve myself as quietly as possible. The warm urine soaked into my jeans, and I felt gross and ashamed, but it was better than wetting myself completely or risking standing up. The sky started to lighten. I could see bits of pink and orange through the leaves. It was surreal, watching the sun come up while hiding from a shooter. Birds started chirping like it was any other morning. How could they act so normal when everything was so wrong? As it got lighter, I started to hear more activity, more voices, more movement. It sounded organized, not panicked like before. I risked peeking out through the leaves. I could see people in uniforms moving around, police, SWAT teams, maybe even FBI. They were going building to building, guns drawn. I wanted to call out to them, to run to safety, but I was still too scared. What if the shooter was still out there? What if they saw me and shot me before the police could react? So I stayed hidden, watching. Finally, I heard someone on a megaphone. They were announcing that the campus was secure, that the shooter had been apprehended, but they were still asking everyone to stay in place until they could do a thorough sweep. I didn't move. I'd been hiding for so long, I almost didn't know how to do anything else. I watched as more and more students and faculty were evacuated from buildings. Everyone looked shell-shocked. It was almost noon when a police officer finally found me. He was doing a sweep of the area and nearly walked right past my bush. I made a small noise and he spun around, gun raised. I quickly identified myself, hands in the air as I crawled out of the bushes. The officer looked surprised to find me there. He asked if I was hurt and I shook my head. Physically, I was fine. Just sore, dirty, and probably smelling like pee. He radioed for someone to come get me and stayed with me until another officer arrived to escort me to the evacuation area. As we walked across campus, I saw the damage for the first time. There were broken windows, bullet holes in walls, abandoned backpacks, and phones scattered around. It looked like a war zone. At the evacuation area, there were paramedics checking people out. One of them looked me over, but aside from some scratches from the bushes, I was okay. They gave me a blanket and some water. That's when I finally heard what had happened. The shooter was a student, a junior named Mark. Apparently, he'd had some kind of breakdown due to the stress of finals. He'd gotten a gun somehow and just started shooting randomly around campus. 3 people were dead, 12 others were injured, some critically. I recognized some of the names they listed. People I'd had classes with, seen around campus. It didn't seem real. They kept us in the evacuation area for hours, taking statements and trying to account for everyone. My parents showed up at some point. I guess the university had called them. They hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. College was supposed to be this amazing experience, you know? New friends, parties, learning stuff I actually cared about. And for the first few weeks, it was great. I got along with my roommate Laura right away. We'd stay up late talking about our classes, our families, our dreams. It felt like I'd known her forever. But then things started to change. It was subtle at first. Laura would get irritated if I came back to the room late after studying. She'd make these little comments about my clothes or the way I organized my desk. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe she was just stressed about exams or homesick. As the semester went on, the tension in our room got worse. Laura would give me the silent treatment for days, then act like nothing had happened. She started moving my stuff around when I wasn't there. Once I came back to find she'd rearranged our entire room without asking me. I tried to talk to her about it, but she'd always turn it around on me. She'd say I was being too sensitive or that I was the one with the problem. It got to the point where I dreaded going back to my own room. I started spending more time in the library or at friends' places just to avoid the awkwardness. Around midterms, I started feeling off. At first, I thought it was just stress and lack of sleep. I had headaches that wouldn't go away, no matter how much water I drank or how many painkillers I took. My stomach was constantly upset, and I felt nauseous most of the time. I figured it was just the cafeteria food or a bug going around campus. But as the weeks went by, I didn't get better. I was always tired, even after sleeping for 10 hours. My hair started falling out in clumps when I showered. I had these weird muscle spasms that made it hard to concentrate in class. I went to the campus health center, but they just told me it was probably stress and to get more rest. The breaking point came when Laura accidentally spilled coffee all over my laptop. It was the night before a big paper was due and I lost hours of work. She barely apologized, just shrugged and said these things happen. That's when I knew I couldn't live with her anymore. I went to the housing office the next day and begged for a room change. I told them about the tension, the passive-aggressive behavior, how uncomfortable I felt in my own space. I didn't mention my health issues. I still thought they were unrelated. The housing coordinator must have seen how desperate I was because she agreed to move me as soon as a spot opened up. For the next week, things were incredibly tense in the room. Laura barely spoke to me, which was fine by me. I started packing up my stuff little by little, not wanting to tip her off that I was leaving. I was worried about how she'd react when she found out. The day of the move came and I felt this huge wave of relief. My new roommate, Emma, seemed nice and normal. As I unpacked in my new room, I realized how tense I'd been for months. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Over the next few days, I started feeling better physically too. My headaches went away, my stomach settled, and I had more energy. I figured it was just the stress of living with Laura that had been making me sick. About a week after I moved, I ran into Jake, a guy who lived on our floor. He asked how I was doing after everything that happened with Laura. I was confused. As far as I knew, nothing had happened except for us not getting along. That's when Jake dropped the bomb. Apparently, Laura had been bragging to some people about how she'd been slowly poisoning me. She'd been putting something in my food, my drinks, even my shampoo. She'd been increasing the dose over time, seeing how sick she could make me before I figured it out. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I felt like I was going to throw up. All those months of feeling sick, thinking it was stress or bad luck, it had been Laura the whole time. Jake said she was furious when she found out I'd moved out. She told people that if I'd stayed just a little longer, I might not have survived. I went straight to campus security with what Jake told me. They took it seriously right away. They searched our old room and found a stash of chemicals hidden in Laura's closet. They tested my old toiletries and found traces of the same stuff. The next few days were a blur of police interviews and medical tests. They found high levels of heavy metals in my system: lead, arsenic, mercury. The doctors said I was lucky I'd moved out when I did. A few more weeks of exposure could have caused permanent damage. Laura was arrested and expelled from the university. They found evidence on her computer of her researching poisons and their effects. She'd been planning this for months, maybe even before we met. They never really figured out why she did it. Some people said she was jealous of me. Others thought she just enjoyed the power trip of making someone sick. I was doing an internship at our campus radio station, WKCU. It was my second semester, and I'd gotten used to running the late-night shift. That Friday night, I was alone in the booth, playing tracks for the midnight hour. The station was in the basement of the Student Union building, which was pretty much deserted at that time of night. After finishing a set of indie rock, the studio phone lit up. It wasn't unusual to get calls from students requesting songs or just chatting, so I didn't think much of it. When I answered, I heard a low, gravelly voice that was nothing like our usual callers. The man on the phone demanded that I play The Final Countdown by Europe. He then threatened to blow up the radio station if I didn't comply. At first, I thought it was some kind of sick joke or a prank call from a bored student. I tried to laugh it off, but something about the caller's tone made me extremely uncomfortable. When I tried to brush it off as a joke, the caller's voice became even more menacing. He insisted it wasn't a joke, claimed he had a bomb, and gave me 5 minutes to play the song or he would detonate it. Then the line went dead. For a moment, I just sat there trying to process what had just happened. My hands were shaking as I put down the receiver. Looking around the small booth, I suddenly felt very exposed. The windows that usually made me feel connected to the rest of the campus now seemed like a vulnerability. I tried to rationalize the situation, thinking it had to be a prank. But a nagging doubt kept creeping in. What if it wasn't? What if there really was a bomb? I couldn't just ignore it. Glancing at the clock, I realized I had only 4 minutes left. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I looked at the computer, unsure of what to do. It would have been easy to just play the song, but I thought about the implications. If I gave in, what would stop this person from making more demands? And if it was a real threat, playing the song wouldn't guarantee anyone's safety. With shaking hands, I called campus security. I tried to explain the situation as calmly as possible, and to their credit, they took me seriously right away. They told me to stay where I was and that they were sending officers immediately. They also instructed me not to touch anything and not to play the song. The next few minutes were incredibly tense. I sat in the booth, staring at the door, jumping at every little sound. When the song that was playing ended, I quickly queued up another one, trying to act normal in case the bomber was listening. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, 2 campus police officers rushed in. They immediately started evacuating the building. As we emerged outside, I saw more police cars arriving with their lights flashing silently. Students who had been walking by stopped to stare and whisper to each other. One of the officers questioned me about the call while the other coordinated with the arriving backup. I told them everything I could remember, my voice shaking the entire time. The whole situation felt surreal, like I was watching it happen to someone else. More police arrived, along with what appeared to be a bomb squad. They cordoned off the area around the student union building, pushing everyone back. I watched as they entered the building, feeling sick to my stomach. The wait seemed endless. Students gathered at the edges of the police line speculating about what was happening. I could hear snippets of conversation and rumors already starting to spread. I wanted to tell everyone to get as far away as possible, but I couldn't find my voice. The campus was eerily quiet, with only the occasional murmur from the gathered crowd and the crackle of police radios breaking the silence. The night air felt heavy with tension, and every minute that passed seemed to stretch on forever. I kept replaying the phone call in my head, wondering if there was something I missed, some clue that could help the police. As time dragged on, more and more curious students emerged from nearby dorms, drawn by the commotion. The crowd at the police line grew, with people speculating wildly about what was happening. Some thought it was a fire, others a gas leak. No one seemed to consider the possibility of a bomb threat. I sat on the curb, feeling completely drained. The adrenaline that had been coursing through my veins was starting to wear off, leaving me feeling shaky and exhausted. A police officer brought me a bottle of water, but I couldn't bring myself to drink it. My throat felt too tight, like I might choke if I tried to swallow. The bomb squad had been in the building for what felt like hours. Every time the door opened, I tensed up, expecting to hear the worst. But each time, it was just another officer going in or coming out, their faces grim and focused. I couldn't help but think about how ordinary the night had started. Just a few hours ago, I was sitting in that booth playing music, thinking about nothing more serious than what tracks to queue up next. Now, I was sitting outside, watching a bomb squad search for an explosive device that I had inadvertently brought to everyone's attention. The sky was starting to lighten, the first hints of dawn appearing on the horizon, when there was suddenly a flurry of activity at the building's entrance. The bomb squad emerged, carrying something between them. It was a small, nondescript backpack. One of the officers who had been questioning me earlier came over. His face was grim as he informed me that they had indeed found a device. It was crude, but functional, he said. If it had gone off, the damage would have been significant. The realization that it had all been real, the threat, the bomb, hit me like a physical blow. My legs went weak, and I had to sit down on the curb again. My head was spinning as I tried to process everything that had just happened. The campus that had always felt safe, our little bubble away from the real world, had been violated in the most terrifying way. I was a sophomore at State University, living in the dorms on campus. It was finals week, and I had this huge exam for my advanced biochemistry class the next day. I'd been putting off studying, so I decided to pull an all-nighter to cram. My roommate was staying at his girlfriend's place, so I had the room to myself. I sat up at my desk, right by the window, with my textbooks, notes, and a big cup of coffee. The campus was really quiet that late at night, just the occasional sound of a car passing by on the street below. I'd been studying for a few hours when I started to feel a bit uneasy. You know that feeling when you think someone's watching you? It was like that. I tried to shake it off and focus on my notes, but it kept nagging at me. Every now and then I'd hear these little noises outside. At first I thought it was just the wind or maybe a bird, but they kept happening, and they seemed to be getting closer to my window. I tried to ignore them and concentrate on my studying, but it was getting harder to focus. The noises were really starting to freak me out. They sounded like scratching or tapping, but really faint. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me because I was tired and stressed about the exam. I got up to stretch my legs and get some water. When I came back to my desk, I noticed that the noises had stopped. I felt relieved and thought maybe I had just been paranoid. I sat back down and tried to get back into my studying. But then, just as I was starting to relax, I heard a much louder noise. It was like a scraping sound right outside my window. I froze, my pen hovering over my notebook. The sound came again, and this time I was sure it wasn't my imagination. I sat there, not moving, barely breathing, just listening. The scraping noise continued, and now I could hear something that sounded like heavy breathing. It was so close, like whatever was making the noise was right on the other side of the glass. I didn't want to look up. I kept my eyes fixed on my textbook, but I wasn't reading anything. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a logical explanation for what I was hearing. Maybe it was a raccoon or a really big bird, but deep down I knew it wasn't an animal. The noises stopped for a moment, and in the silence I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then there was a soft thud against the window, like someone had pressed their hand against the glass. I couldn't help it. I looked up. There, staring right at me through the window, was a face. It was pressed so close to the glass that its features were distorted, but I could clearly see its eyes. They were wide open, bloodshot, and fixed directly on me. I screamed. I couldn't help it. It was like all the fear and tension that had been building up just exploded out of me. I fell backwards out of my chair, scrambling away from the window. The face disappeared instantly. 1 second it was there, and the next it was gone. I could hear rapid footsteps on the fire escape outside my window getting fainter as they descended. I was shaking so bad I could barely stand up. I stumbled to my door, fumbling with the lock, and ran out into the hallway. A few other students had come out of their rooms looking confused and annoyed. I must have woken them up with my scream. I was trying to explain what had happened, but I wasn't making much sense. Someone must have called campus security because they showed up a few minutes later. The security officers tried to calm me down and get me to explain what had happened. I told them about the noises, the face at the window, everything. They looked skeptical at first, but they took it seriously enough to go check it out. While one officer stayed with me and the other students in the hallway, 2 more went outside to investigate. They were out there for what felt like forever, shining their flashlights around the building and checking the fire escape. When they came back in, their faces were grim. They'd found something. On the fire escape, right outside my window, they'd discovered fresh scuff marks on the metal, and there was something else. A small piece of fabric caught on one of the screws, like it had been torn from someone's clothing as they climbed down in a hurry. That's when they told us the really scary part. Apparently, there had been reports over the past few weeks of someone climbing the fire escapes and peeping into windows around campus. They'd been keeping it quiet to avoid causing a panic, but now they couldn't deny it anymore. The realization that this wasn't just a one-time thing, that someone had been doing this for weeks, made my blood run cold. How many times had this person been outside my window without me noticing? How many other students had they watched? Campus security called the local police, and soon the whole area was swarming with cops. They were interviewing everyone in the dorm, asking if we'd seen or heard anything suspicious over the past few weeks. As the night wore on, more and more disturbing details came to light. Other students started coming forward with stories of strange noises outside their windows, a feeling like they were being watched. One girl even said she'd woken up one night to see a shadow moving outside her 3rd-floor window. The police brought in dogs to try and track the intruder's scent, but they lost it at the edge of campus. They found more evidence on other fire escapes, more scuff marks, another piece of fabric, even a partial fingerprint on one of the windows. By the time the sun came up, the whole campus was on edge. Classes were canceled for the day, and the administration called an emergency meeting to address the situation. They increased security patrols, installed new lighting around the dorms, and started a buddy system for students walking around campus at night. But they never caught the person. Despite all the evidence, despite all the police presence, the window peeper seemed to have vanished into thin air. The investigation continued, but they never found any solid leads. The campus was left in a state of unease, with everyone wondering if and when the mysterious figure might return. I'm in my junior year at State University, and I've always been a pretty serious student. My friends and I formed this study group at the beginning of the semester. There were 5 of us: me, Sarah, John, Jess, and Alex. We'd meet up a few times a week to go over our coursework, especially when we had big exams coming up. We usually met in the library, in this quiet basement area. It was perfect because not many people knew about it, so we could talk without disturbing anyone. Plus, it had these big tables where we could spread out all our books and notes. This one night, we were studying for our midterms. It was a pretty important exam, so we decided to stay late. We'd been there for hours, going over our notes, quizzing each other, and trying to cram as much information into our brains as possible. I remember looking up at one point and realizing that the library had gotten really quiet. Usually, you could hear the faint sounds of people walking around upstairs or the occasional cough or whisper. But now it was just silent. I mentioned it to the others and we all kind of looked around. That's when we noticed that we couldn't see anyone else in the basement. It was just us. We figured it must be getting pretty late, so we decided to start packing up our stuff. As we were gathering our things, I had this weird feeling. You know when you feel like someone's watching you? It was like that, but stronger. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone there. But the basement was empty except for us. We were just about done packing up when it happened. The lights went out. Not just flickered, but completely went out. 1 second we could see, and the next we were in total darkness. It was so sudden that Sarah let out a little yelp of surprise. For a moment we all just stood there, frozen. Then John said we should use our phone flashlights. We all fumbled around in the dark, trying to get our phones out. I remember my hands were shaking a bit as I tried to unlock my screen. Once we got our flashlights on, things didn't seem so bad at first. We could see each other and our immediate surroundings. But as we started to look around the basement, that's when things got really creepy. The beams from our flashlights were creating all these weird shadows. The bookshelves that had seemed so normal before now looked ominous, like they were looming over us. And the darkness beyond where our lights could reach seemed to press in on us from all sides. We decided we needed to get out of there. None of us wanted to admit it, but I think we were all pretty freaked out. We started making our way towards the stairs that led up to the main floor of the library. That's when we heard it. A sound. It was faint at first, just on the edge of hearing, like a soft scraping noise. We all stopped and looked at each other. I could see the fear on my friends' faces, and I'm sure they could see it on mine too. We tried to convince ourselves it was nothing. Maybe it was just the building settling or something. But then we heard it again, louder this time. And it definitely wasn't coming from upstairs. It was coming from somewhere in the basement with us. I swear my legs felt like they were made of lead as we started moving again, faster this time. We were trying to be quiet, but our footsteps seemed so loud in the silence. And all the while, that scraping noise kept happening, getting closer and closer. As we were hurrying towards the stairs, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow moving in the darkness just beyond the reach of our flashlights. I turned my head to look, but it was gone. I told myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but deep down I knew it wasn't. We finally reached the stairs and practically ran up them. But when we got to the top, we hit another problem. The door was locked. We pushed and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. We were trapped in the basement. That's when the panic really set in. Jess started crying, and I could hear the fear in John's voice as he suggested we try calling for help. We all pulled out our phones, but of course there was no signal in the basement. We started banging on the door, yelling for help, but the library was closed, and we had no idea if anyone would even be in the building to hear us. All the while, we kept hearing that scraping noise from down in the basement, and it seemed to be getting closer. I don't know how long we were there, pounding on the door and shouting. It felt like hours, but it was probably only about 20 minutes. We were all exhausted and terrified. Every few seconds, we'd shine our flashlights down the stairs, half expecting to see someone, or something, coming up after us. Then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, we heard footsteps. But they weren't coming from the basement. They were coming from the other side of the door. We all fell silent, holding our breath. Was it security coming to let us out? Or was it something else? The footsteps stopped right outside the door. There was a moment of silence that felt like it lasted forever. Then we heard the sound of keys jingling, and the door started to open. The rush of relief I felt when I saw the security guard standing there was overwhelming. We all started talking at once, trying to explain what had happened. The guard looked confused and a bit annoyed, probably thinking we were just a bunch of students who had fallen asleep in the library or something. He let us out and started to head down to the basement to check things out. We followed him, not wanting to be left alone. But when we got down there, everything looked normal. The lights were working fine, and there was no sign of anything unusual. The guard did a quick sweep of the area but didn't find anything out of place. He seemed skeptical of our story, and to be honest, standing there in the well-lit basement, it was hard to believe what we'd experienced ourselves. As we were leaving the library, the guard told us he'd file a report about the incident, but the look on his face made it clear he thought we were either pulling a prank or had let our imaginations run wild. We all left the library that night with more questions than answers. What had really happened in that basement? Was there actually someone down there with us, or had we all just scared ourselves over nothing? And if it was just our imaginations, how could we all have experienced the same thing? To this day, I still don't know what to make of what happened that night in the library basement. All I know is that whenever I think about it, I get that same feeling of unease. And I can't help but wonder, what if we hadn't been able to get out? I'm a college student at State University, and like most of my classmates, I was trying to save money on housing. That's how I ended up renting this cheap apartment off campus. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small one-bedroom place in an old building about a 15-minute walk from campus. But it was all I could afford, and I was just happy to have my own space. The apartment was on the top floor of a 3-story building. It was pretty basic: a tiny kitchen, a living room that doubled as my study area, a small bedroom, and a bathroom that had seen better days. The walls were thin, and I could often hear my neighbors, but I figured that was just part of apartment living. I'd been living there for about 6 months when I first noticed the smell. It was faint at first, just a slight, musty odor that I noticed when I came home one day. I didn't think much of it at the time. Old buildings often have weird smells, right? I just opened a window and forgot about it. But over the next few days, the smell got stronger. It was hard to describe. Kind of like rotting food, but different. Moustier, maybe. I started checking around the apartment, looking for the source. I cleaned out my fridge, thinking maybe something had gone bad in there. I took out all the trash, scrubbed the bathroom, even checked under the sink for any leaks that might be causing mold, but nothing seemed to be the source of the smell. As the days went on, the odor just kept getting worse. It was strongest in my bedroom, which made it hard to sleep. I'd wake up in the middle of the night. The smell so strong it almost made me gag. I started sleeping on the couch in the living room, but even that didn't help much. I tried everything I could think of to get rid of the smell. I bought air fresheners, scented candles, even one of those plug-in air purifiers. Nothing worked. The smell just seemed to get stronger, overpowering everything else. It was starting to affect my daily life. I couldn't concentrate on my studies because the smell was so distracting. I was embarrassed to invite friends over because I knew they'd notice it. I even started spending more time on campus just to get away from the stench in my apartment. After about 2 weeks of this, I finally broke down and talked to some of my neighbors. I was worried they might think I was crazy, but I had to know if anyone else was experiencing this. To my surprise, a couple of them had noticed a weird smell too, though they said it wasn't as strong in their apartments. That's when I started to get really worried. If the smell was strongest in my apartment, that meant the source had to be nearby. I started coming up with all sorts of theories. Was there a dead animal in the walls? A sewage leak? I even wondered if maybe there was a meth lab in the building or something. I knew I needed to call maintenance, but I was hesitant. What if they couldn't find anything? What if they thought I was just being overly sensitive or making it up? But finally, after another sleepless night on the couch, I couldn't take it anymore. I called the building manager and told them about the smell. They said they'd send someone over that afternoon, I spent the morning pacing around my apartment, alternating between relief that someone was finally going to look into it and anxiety about what they might find. When the maintenance guy showed up, I could tell he noticed the smell right away. His face scrunched up as soon as he walked in the door. He started looking around, checking all the same places I had: under the sink, behind the fridge, in the bathroom. He even went out into the hallway to see if the smell was coming from somewhere else in the building. After about an hour of searching, he still hadn't found anything. I could tell he was puzzled. He kept saying he'd never smelled anything quite like it before. That's when he decided to check the crawl space above my bedroom. I didn't even know there was a crawl space up there. He had to go get a ladder from his truck to reach the small access panel in the ceiling of my bedroom closet. As he opened it, the smell got even stronger. I was standing in the doorway of my bedroom watching as he shined his flashlight up into the dark space. Suddenly, he went very still. He was halfway up the ladder, his head and shoulders inside the crawl space, and he just froze. After a moment, he slowly backed down the ladder. His face had gone pale and he looked like he was going to be sick. He told me to wait in the living room while he made a phone call. I could hear him talking in a low, urgent voice, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. A few minutes later, he came back and told me that he had called the police. I was confused and scared. Why would he need to call the police? What could possibly be up there that would require law enforcement? He wouldn't give me any details, just told me to wait for the police to arrive. The next hour was a blur. Police cars showed up, their lights flashing but sirens off. Officers came into my apartment, followed by people in plain clothes who I later learned were detectives. They all went into my bedroom, and I could hear them talking in hushed, serious tones. Finally, one of the detectives came out to talk to me. That's when I found out the horrifying truth. There was a body in the crawl space above my bedroom, a human body. And from what they could tell, it had been there for months. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. A body? In my apartment? Above where I'd been sleeping every night? I couldn't process it. The detective was asking me questions, but I could barely focus on what he was saying. All I could think about was that I'd been living, sleeping, going about my daily life, with a dead body just feet away from me. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. More police arrived, along with the coroner's office. They brought in special equipment to remove the body. I sat in a daze on my couch watching as people in protective suits went in and out of my bedroom. As the day wore on, I learned a few more details. The body was badly decomposed, which explained the smell. They couldn't tell much about it at the scene, not even if it was male or female. They'd have to do an autopsy to determine the cause of death and try to identify the person. The police asked me all sorts of questions. How long had I lived there? Had I noticed anything suspicious? Had I heard any strange noises? I told them everything I could, but I felt useless. How could I have not known? How could I have slept every night with a dead body right above me? As night fell, the police finally finished their initial investigation. They told me they'd need to do some more work in the apartment over the next few days. They advised me to find somewhere else to stay for a while. I nodded numbly, still in shock. I packed a bag with some clothes and essentials, not really thinking about what I was doing. As I left the apartment, I looked back at my bedroom door. Just a few hours ago, it had been just a normal room. Now, I knew I'd never be able to look at it the same way again. I walked out of the building in a daze, the flashing lights of the police cars still illuminating the street. As I stood there on the sidewalk, bag in hand, I couldn't help but think about all the nights I'd spent in that apartment. All the times I'd complained about the smell, tried to cover it up, never imagining the horrifying truth. I'm a junior at State University, majoring in psychology. My days are usually pretty routine: classes, study sessions, and hanging out with friends. That day started like any other. I had a full schedule of classes, including an important lecture in the afternoon that I couldn't miss. The campus is pretty big, with lots of old and new buildings mixed together. My afternoon class was in one of the older buildings, Thornton Hall. It's this tall brick building with small windows and narrow hallways. I've had classes there before, but I always feel a bit claustrophobic in it. I got to Thornton Hall a bit early, wanting to review my notes before the lecture. The elevator in this building is old and slow, but I was feeling lazy and didn't want to climb 4 flights of stairs. I pressed the button and waited. When the elevator arrived, there was already someone inside. He was a guy I didn't recognize, probably in his late 20s or early 30s. He smiled and nodded as I got in, and I did the same. I pressed the button for the 4th floor and noticed he hadn't selected a floor. As the elevator started moving, I glanced at him again. He was wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt, nothing unusual, but something about him made me feel uneasy. Maybe it was the way he kept looking at me, or how he seemed to be standing a bit too close in the small elevator. We had only gone up 1 floor when it happened. The lights flickered, and then everything went dark. The elevator jerked to a stop and I lost my balance, stumbling against the wall. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then the emergency lights came on, casting a dim, eerie glow in the elevator. I could see the guy's face now, looking as surprised as I felt. He said something about a power outage, and I nodded, trying to stay calm. I reached for my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. The guy, he said his name was Chris, tried the emergency call button, but nothing happened. We were stuck. At first, we just waited, figuring someone would get us out soon. Chris started talking, asking about my classes, telling me he was visiting the campus. He seemed friendly enough, and I thought maybe I had been too quick to judge him earlier. But as time passed and no one came, I started to feel more and more anxious. It was hot in the elevator and the air felt thick and stuffy. I kept checking my phone, hoping for a signal, but nothing. That's when I noticed Chris's behavior starting to change. He began pacing in the small space, his movements jerky and agitated. His friendly conversation turned into a rambling monologue. He started talking about how the university was watching him, how they had secrets they were trying to hide. I tried to keep my responses neutral, not wanting to agree with his paranoid ideas, but also not wanting to upset him. The space in the elevator felt even smaller now, and I was acutely aware of how close he was to me. As more time passed, Chris's behavior became even more erratic. He would switch between angry rants about the university and unsettling personal stories. He talked about fights he'd been in, bragging about how he'd taught people lessons when they crossed him. I was getting more scared by the minute. I pressed myself into the corner of the elevator, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do if he became violent. Then Chris's attention focused directly on me. He started asking personal questions: where I lived, if I had a boyfriend, what my schedule was like. His tone was different now, more intense. I gave vague answers, trying not to provide any real information. The situation reached a breaking point when Chris suddenly slammed his fist against the elevator wall. The sound echoed in the small space, making me jump. He started yelling about how I was just like the rest of them, whatever that meant. I was terrified. My hands were shaking and I could feel sweat running down my back. I kept my eyes on Chris, watching his every move, ready to defend myself if I had to. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I heard something. A faint sound of voices and movement outside the elevator. Chris heard it too, and his demeanor changed again. He became very still, listening intently. The voices got louder, and then there was a banging on the elevator doors. Someone was calling out, asking if anyone was inside. I wanted to shout back, but Chris gave me a look that made the words die in my throat. As the rescue team worked to open the doors, Chris moved to the other side of the elevator, as far from me as possible. He was muttering to himself, but I couldn't make out the words. Finally, after what felt like hours, the doors began to open. Light flooded in, momentarily blinding me. As soon as the gap was wide enough, I squeezed through, practically falling into the arms of the rescue team. Everything after that was a blur. Security guards were there, asking questions. Someone wrapped a blanket around my shoulders. I was trying to explain what happened when I overheard one of the guards talking about Chris. They were saying he wasn't a student or even associated with the university. Apparently, he had a history of trespassing on campus and had been involved in several violent incidents in the past. As they led Chris away, I caught a final glimpse of his face. The look he gave me sent chills through my body. It was a mixture of anger and something else, like he had unfinished business. I stood there, watching as they took him away, realizing how close I had come to something potentially much worse. The thought that I had been trapped in that small space with someone so unstable, someone who could have seriously hurt me, was overwhelming. The security guards told me they would need a statement, but all I could think about was how differently things could have turned out if the power hadn't come back on when it did. And I couldn't shake the feeling that even though Chris was gone, this wasn't really over. I worked at the campus coffee shop to help pay for my tuition. It was usually a pretty chill job, especially during the late shifts. That night I was working the closing shift. It was a Wednesday, and Wednesdays were typically slow. Most students were either studying or out at the local bars, so I expected a quiet night. The coffee shop was in the student center, a big building near the heart of campus. It had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto the main quad. At night, the quad was lit by street lamps casting long shadows across the grass. Inside, the shop had this cozy vibe with soft lighting and comfortable chairs. Usually, it was a relaxing place to be. As the night went on, things were going as expected. A few students were camped out with their laptops typing away. The campus security guard, Dave, had stopped by for his usual coffee. Everything seemed normal. It was getting close to closing time when I noticed something odd. A group of people were walking across the quad heading straight for the student center. They were moving fast and purposefully, which was unusual for that time of night. Something about the way they moved made me uneasy. As they got closer, I realized they were all wearing masks. Not like medical masks, but full-face masks that covered everything except their eyes. They were dressed in dark clothes, and I could see they were carrying something. Before I could even process what was happening, they burst through the doors. There were 5 of them, and they were carrying guns. Big ones, the kind you see in action movies but hope never to see in real life. Everything happened so fast. One second I was wiping down the counter, and the next I was face to face with the barrel of a gun. The leader of the group, a tall guy with piercing blue eyes visible through his mask, shouted for everyone to get down on the ground. The few students in the shop started screaming. I remember the sound of a laptop crashing to the floor as someone dropped to their knees. The security guard, Dave, reached for his radio, but one of the masked men was on him in a second, knocking him out cold with the butt of his gun. I was frozen behind the counter, my hands raised. The leader pointed his gun directly at me and told me to come out from behind the counter and lie down with the others. My legs felt like jelly as I walked around and laid face down on the cold tile floor. One of the masked men started moving around, zip-tying everyone's hands behind their backs. The plastic cut into my wrists as he tightened it. I could hear whimpering and quiet sobs from the students around me. The leader started talking then. He said they were there to send a message, that the university had secrets, and it was time for the truth to come out. He said if their demands weren't met, they'd start killing hostages. Time seemed to stretch out endlessly. I had no idea how long we'd been lying there. My arms were aching from being tied behind my back, and I could feel the cold from the floor seeping into my bones. Every now and then, one of the masked men would pace near us, their heavy boots thudding on the floor. At some point, I heard sirens in the distance. The masked men got agitated, shouting at each other in a language I didn't understand. The leader made a call on a cell phone, yelling about deadlines and consequences. As the night wore on, the situation got more and more tense. One of the students started having a panic attack, hyperventilating and crying. One of the masked men kicked him, telling him to shut up. I wanted to help, to say something, but I was too terrified to make a sound. The leader kept making calls, his voice getting more angry and desperate each time. He started ranting about government conspiracies and secret research. It was like listening to a crazy person, except this crazy person had us all at gunpoint. I don't know how many hours passed. My concept of time was completely warped. I just remember lying there trying to stay as still as possible, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Suddenly there was a loud bang from outside. The masked men started shouting, and I heard the sound of furniture being moved. They were barricading the doors. More bangs followed, and I realized they were gunshots. Everything erupted into chaos. There was the sound of breaking glass, and suddenly the room was filled with smoke. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear shouting and more gunshots. Someone fell on top of me, and I couldn't breathe. The next thing I knew, someone was cutting the zip ties off my wrists. As the smoke cleared, I saw that the room was full of police in tactical gear. They were helping people up, guiding us outside. As I stumbled out of the building, the quad was filled with flashing lights from police cars and ambulances. There were news vans too, their bright lights illuminating the scene like it was daytime. That's when I found out what had really happened. It wasn't just a robbery gone wrong or some random act of violence, it was a terrorist attack. The group had targeted our university because of some research being done in the science department. Something about bioweapons or chemical warfare. I'm not really sure. As I sat in the back of an ambulance, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, I watched as the police led the masked men away in handcuffs. Their masks had been removed, and I was struck by how ordinary they looked. They could have been anyone, students, professors, the guy who works at the local grocery store. The whole experience felt surreal, like something out of a movie. But the bruises on my wrists from the zip ties and the lingering smell of smoke in my hair were very real reminders of what had happened. As the sun began to rise over the campus, casting a warm glow over the chaos of the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the world had fundamentally changed. The campus that had been my home for the past 3 years suddenly felt alien and dangerous. And I knew that every time I closed my eyes, I'd see those masks and those guns, hear those angry voices making demands. The night was over, but I had a feeling its effects would last a long, long time. I was a sophomore at Westfield State University, living in the Lammers Hall dorm. It was a co-ed dorm, but our floor was all girls. We had a communal bathroom at the end of the hall, which was fine most of the time. You just got used to it. That night, I had a late study session at the library. I got back to the dorm around 11 p.m. The hall was quiet. Most people were either asleep or still out. I grabbed my shower caddy and towel, heading to the bathroom like I'd done 100 times before. The bathroom was empty when I got there. It was a large room with several shower stalls along one wall, toilet stalls on the other, and a row of sinks in the middle. I picked the shower stall furthest from the door, like I always did. It just felt more private that way. I hung my towel on the hook outside the stall and placed my shower caddy on the little shelf inside. The water was warm, and I started to relax after a long day of classes and studying. I could hear the pipes creaking, a familiar sound in this old building. As I was rinsing my hair, I thought I heard the bathroom door open. It wasn't unusual for other girls to come in, so I didn't think much of it. But then I realized I couldn't hear any other shower running or toilets flushing. Just silence. I finished my shower and reached for my towel, but my hand grasped at empty air. I peeked out of the stall, water dripping into my eyes. My towel was gone, so were my clothes and shower caddy that I'd left on the bench nearby. For a moment I thought I was going crazy. Did I forget to bring my stuff? No. I clearly remembered hanging up my towel. I looked around, thinking maybe someone had moved my things as a prank, but the bathroom was empty and my belongings were nowhere in sight. I stood there dripping wet and completely naked, trying to figure out what to do. The bathroom suddenly felt very big and very exposed. I could feel goosebumps rising on my skin, and not just from the cold air. I thought about making a run for it back to my room. It wasn't far, just down the hall. But the idea of running naked through the dorm corridor was mortifying. What if someone saw me? I decided to wait a few minutes, hoping whoever took my stuff would bring it back. It had to be a prank, right? Someone trying to be funny. But as the minutes ticked by and no one came, I started to panic. I cracked open the bathroom door, peering out into the hallway. That's when I saw them. A group of guys, maybe 5 or 6 of them, standing at the end of the hall. They were holding phones, pointing them in my direction. One of them had a proper camera. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding. This wasn't a prank, this was something much worse. I pressed my back against the door, as if my body could keep them out. My mind was racing, trying to understand what was happening. I remembered hearing rumors about something like this happening to other girls in different dorms. Stories about guys stealing girls' clothes while they showered, forcing them to run naked back to their rooms while they took pictures. I had dismissed those stories as urban legends, the kind of thing that gets passed around but never actually happens. But now, it was happening to me. I was trapped. If I left the bathroom, those guys would get pictures of me naked, pictures that would undoubtedly end up online, shared around campus and beyond. But I couldn't stay in the bathroom forever. Eventually, someone would come in, or those guys might even try to come in themselves. I looked around the bathroom, desperately searching for anything I could use to cover myself. There was nothing. No spare towels, no lost clothing items, not even a trash bag. Just cold, white tiles and mirrors that seemed to mock my predicament. I could hear muffled voices from the hallway. The guys were talking, laughing. I caught fragments of their conversation. They were getting impatient, wondering how long I'd stay in there. One of them suggested trying to force the door open. That's when the fear really hit me. This wasn't just about embarrassing photos anymore. These guys were willing to physically force their way in. The situation had escalated from humiliating to genuinely dangerous. I tried to think of a way out. Could I call for help? My phone was in my room. Could I scream? But what if no one heard me? Or worse, what if it just encouraged those guys to break in? I felt utterly helpless, more vulnerable than I'd ever been in my life. Time seemed to stretch on forever as I stood there, shivering, trying to come up with a plan. I thought about my parents, my friends. What would they think if those photos got out? How would I face anyone on campus again? Then I heard another sound, footsteps coming down the hall but from the opposite direction of where the guys were. I heard a female voice sounding confused and a bit annoyed. She was asking the guys what they were doing, why they were on the girls' floor. I saw my chance. I cracked the door open just enough to call out to her. I quickly explained my situation, my voice shaking. I could hear the guys trying to laugh it off, saying it was just a joke. But the girl understood immediately. She came to the bathroom door, shielding the view from the guys. She had a large hoodie on, which she took off and passed to me through the barely open door. It wasn't much, but it was enough to cover me. With her standing guard, I slipped the hoodie on. It fell to my mid-thighs. Not ideal, but better than nothing. She helped me make a dash to my room, positioning herself between me and the guys the whole time. Once in my room, I locked the door and sank to the floor, my legs too shaky to hold me up anymore. I could hear commotion in the hallway. The girl was confronting the guys, threatening to call campus security. There were other voices now too. Other girls from the floor who had come out to see what was going on. As I sat there trying to process what had just happened, I realized something that made my blood run cold. One of the voices I heard in the hall, one of the guys, sounded familiar. It was a guy from my biology class. Someone I saw 3 times a week, someone I had even studied with in the library. And he had been out there, waiting to take photos of me at my most vulnerable. The next day, I found out I wasn't the first victim. There had been others in different dorms across campus. Some girls had been forced to run to their rooms naked. Some had given in and let the guys take photos just to get their clothes back. All of us had felt that same fear, that same violation. Campus security got involved, but the damage was done. Even though they confiscated the guys' phones, there was no way to know if the pictures had already been uploaded somewhere. Every time I walked into a classroom or the cafeteria, I wondered if someone had seen photos of me. Every time I got a notification on social media, I feared it was someone sending me a link to the pictures. The guys involved were expelled, but that didn't erase what happened. It didn't take away the fear I felt every time I needed to take a shower, or the way I double and triple checked that I had my towel and clothes with me. It didn't stop the nightmares or the constant feeling of being watched. What scared me the most, though, was knowing that it could happen again. To me or to someone else. Because those guys weren't monsters or obvious criminals. They were regular students. They sat next to us in class, ate with us in the dining hall, studied with us in the library. And yet they were capable of something so cruel, so violating. As the weeks passed, I started to hear whispers of similar incidents happening at other colleges. It wasn't just our campus. This was spreading like some kind of twisted trend, and I couldn't help but wonder how many more girls would have to go through what I did before it stopped. How many more would be left feeling vulnerable and violated in a place that was supposed to be safe? The incident in the bathroom lasted less than an hour, but its effects lingered. Every time I walked down that hallway, I remembered the fear, the helplessness. Every time I stepped into the shower, I found myself listening intently for any unusual sounds. And every time I saw a group of guys with phones out, laughing among themselves, I couldn't help but wonder, are they planning their next victim? I was a junior at Westfield State University, working the night shift at the campus convenience store. It was one of those 24-hour places, tucked away in the corner of the student center. I'd been working there for about a semester, mostly to help pay for textbooks and have some extra cash. The night shift was usually pretty quiet. Most students were either sleeping or out at parties, so we didn't get much traffic. I'd spend most of my time restocking shelves, doing homework, or scrolling through my phone. It wasn't the most exciting job, but it was easy money. That night started like any other. I clocked in, relieved the day shift guy, and settled in behind the counter. The store was small, just 4 aisles of snacks, drinks, and basic necessities. From my spot at the register, I could see pretty much the whole place. For the first couple of hours, it was business as usual. A few students came in for energy drinks and late-night snacks. Some guy bought a bunch of cold medicine, probably fighting off the flu that was going around campus. Nothing out of the ordinary. It was getting late when things started to feel off. I remember glancing at the clock and thinking my shift was almost over. That's when he walked in. At first, I didn't think much of it, just another customer. But as soon as the door closed behind him, I felt the atmosphere in the store change. He was a young guy, maybe in his early 20s. He could have been a student, but I didn't recognize him. He was wearing a hoodie with the hood up, which wasn't unusual given the cold weather, but something about the way he was carrying himself made me uneasy. He didn't look at me or acknowledge me in any way. Instead, he went straight to the aisles and started pacing, back and forth, back and forth. I could hear him muttering to himself, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. I kept my eye on him while pretending to be busy at the register. He wasn't shopping. He wasn't even looking at the items on the shelves. He was just pacing and muttering. With each pass, his movements seemed to get more agitated. After a few minutes of this, I started to get really nervous. We had a policy about approaching suspicious customers, but we were also supposed to offer help to anyone who seemed to need it. I debated with myself for a moment, then decided I should at least try to talk to him. I stepped out from behind the counter and called out to him, asking if he needed any help finding anything. That's when everything went sideways. He spun around to face me, and I could see his eyes were wide and unfocused. He started yelling, accusing me of spying on him. He said I had been watching him, that I was part of them, whoever they were. I tried to calm him down, telling him I was just doing my job, but that only seemed to make him angrier. He started grabbing items off the shelves, cans of soda, bags of chips, whatever he could reach, and throwing them at me. I ducked behind the end of an aisle, my heart pounding. I could hear cans exploding as they hit the floor, liquid spilling everywhere. He was still yelling, his words not making any sense. Something about government agents and mind control. I knew I needed to get help, but my phone was behind the counter, and the guy was between me and the register. The panic button was there too. I had never had to use it before, but in that moment, it was all I could think about. I tried to make a run for the counter, but he saw me. A can of energy drink whizzed past my head, missing me by inches. I could feel the wind of it as it flew by. It hit the wall behind me and exploded, spraying sticky liquid everywhere. I changed direction, ducking down another aisle. He followed, still throwing things. A jar of salsa shattered on the floor next to me, and I felt bits of glass and cold salsa hit my leg. I was terrified he would start throwing something heavier, something that could really hurt me if it connected. I made it to the end of the aisle and took a chance, sprinting for the counter. I could hear him right behind me, his footsteps loud on the linoleum floor. I vaulted over the counter, something I didn't even know I could do, and landed hard on the other side. My hand was on the panic button in seconds, pressing it over and over. I knew it only needed to be pressed once, but I couldn't stop. It was like my body was on autopilot. The guy tried to follow me over the counter, but he wasn't as quick. He ended up half sprawled across it, still yelling and grabbing at me. I backed up against the wall, as far from him as I could get in the small space. He managed to get his hands on the container of pens we kept by the register. One by one, he started throwing them at me. I raised my arms to protect my face, feeling the pens hitting my arms and chest. It didn't hurt much, but each impact made me flinch. I don't know how long this went on. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. The whole time, I was wondering where campus security was, why they weren't coming. Had the panic button even worked? Was anyone coming to help me? Just when I thought I couldn't take any more, I heard sirens. The guy heard them too. He stopped throwing things and looked towards the door. For a moment, everything was quiet except for the sound of approaching sirens. Then he turned back to me. The look in his eyes had changed. Before, he had seemed angry and scared. Now he just looked terrified. He started backing away from the counter, looking around like a cornered animal. I stayed where I was, afraid to move. I could see flashing lights through the store windows now. The guy made a break for the door, but as soon as he opened it, 2 campus security officers were there. They took him down quickly. I couldn't see exactly what happened from where I was, but I could hear the scuffle. More officers poured into the store, some restraining the guy, others coming to check on me. As the adrenaline started to wear off, I began to feel the effects of what had just happened. My arms were sore from where the pens had hit them. My leg was stinging where the glass from the salsa jar had cut me. I was shaking all over. The officers asked me if I was okay, if I needed medical attention. I remember shaking my head, even though I wasn't sure if I was okay or not. I just wanted to go home. They took my statement right there in the store. I told them everything I could remember, which felt like both too much and not enough. The whole time I could see other officers dealing with the guy outside. He seemed to have calmed down, but they had him in handcuffs. When they were done questioning me, one of the officers offered to escort me back to my dorm. As we were leaving, I overheard another officer talking on his radio. They were saying something about the guy being a student who had gone off his medication, that he had been causing disturbances all over campus for the past few days. The walk back to my dorm was a blur. I remember the officer trying to reassure me, telling me I had done everything right. But all I could think about was how close I had come to being seriously hurt, how helpless I had felt trapped behind that counter. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the guy's face, heard the sound of cans exploding against the walls. I kept replaying the events in my mind, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. The next morning, I went to the campus store manager and quit my job. I couldn't imagine ever feeling safe in that store again. As I was leaving the office, I saw a group of students heading into the convenience store, laughing and chatting. They had no idea what had happened there just hours before. No idea how quickly a normal night could turn into something terrifying. I walked back to my dorm, passing students going about their day like nothing had happened. But for me, everything had changed. I couldn't shake the feeling that the campus I thought I knew wasn't as safe as I had believed. That guy was still out there somewhere, and I had no idea what might set him off next. Hey there again. Hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to hit the like button and to subscribe to the channel. This will really help the channel to grow, and you can be notified of the new videos. And I have something more for you. I chose another video for you to watch. Just click the card here to go to the video. Hope you like it. See you there.